Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move this thing down, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Reynolds.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to start right out and say, my name's Tom Reynolds. I do smarketing, which combines sales and marketing to help my clients increase their revenue. I've been running a thing called NextGen, which is a 45-minute business brief where business owners can get some great information during the COVID era that they can take away immediately and apply to their business. This is one of my favorite people on earth, Jeff McCausland. One of the many reasons is that when I get the privilege of talking to him, I could let him go for hours and not just listen. I mean, he's got a fascinating person, very bright, a lot of experience. He's a professor and has a very interesting perspective on leadership and organizations and success. So just a quick thing about Jeff, if you ever want to get a tour of Gettysburg and learn the leadership lessons there, if you ever want to go on a tour of Yorktown and get a leadership lesson from those war battles, or to the Alamo, I highly recommend you track down Jeff and arrange for to be part of one of his tours. You will not only learn a lot about history and the truth, as true as history can be, but you'll also walk away with a lot of knowledge on leadership and organization. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball as quickly as I can to Jeff. Please turn off your microphones. If you have questions, you can start putting them into chat. Linda will pull them together and we'll interrupt Jeff at the appropriate times. But I would like Jeff to roll along as he sees fit. Feel really privileged to have you, Jeff. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Tom, it's a great honor and pleasure to be on board with you guys. And Tom is a great friend for many, many years and somebody I admire the great work he does in marketing and online digital marketing, et cetera. He's asked me to talk about organizational culture and change. That might seem to be an odd topic at this particular moment, but I think particularly during crises is a moment when leaders need to think about their culture and think about a change. And you know, if you consider the fact that in Chinese, the symbol for a crisis in Mandarin brings together two symbols, and that's how Chinese writing often works, bringing together two pictures to create a new word. The symbol for crisis then brings together two symbols. One is danger. That makes sense. In a crisis, there is danger. The second symbol is opportunity. And I think right now what many leaders need to think about for their organizations is, in this particular crisis, what are the opportunities? And to stretch that even a step farther, I always like the comment by Rahm Emanuel when he was chief of staff in the White House and subsequently the mayor of Chicago, who once said, never waste a perfectly good crisis. With that in mind, I would argue right now, we in the United States and all organizations are affected really by three crises that are occurring simultaneously. The first, of course, is a pandemic. That's a health issue, and it'll be handled well or poorly by politicians and public health officials, and the possibility of vaccines or treatment plans. The second is an economic crisis brought about largely by the pandemic, and we need to recognize and not forget that the economic crisis we are potentially confronting could be as bad as the Great Depression back in the 1920s. And here in the United States today, at the moment, we see well over 10% unemployment, and the question of how that's all going to turn out in the few months ahead. And then if that wasn't enough to keep us all busy and out of mischief, we have a social justice crisis that has affected our communities, touched off by this one event in Minneapolis, the killing of Mr. George Floyd. So all these crises occur simultaneously. To some degree, they reinforce each other. And I would say also, we may touch on this as we go along, that they have in many ways accelerated perhaps trends that were already occurring, which now have been accelerated. I've had the opportunity the last few months to speak to a lot of business officials, school district leaders that I work with, nonprofit, government services, and there's a lot of amazing creativity and change going on. We'll touch on that a bit later on in the talk. And I always tell people, hey, remember something, that Isaac Newton, most people believe, did his thinking about gravity while he was quarantined during the plague in London, and that Shakespeare wrote several of his plays during a quarantine, as did Tolstoy in some of his writings. So change and creativity can occur during a crisis, but there's no doubt, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of our time on today, change is hard. Somebody once said, the only person who likes change is a wet baby, or as an old boss of mine once told us, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. And if I can stretch quotations one step farther, I always like a quotation by Vladimir Lenin, who once observed, there are decades when nothing happened, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And that might have been what we've seen over the last few months. We talk about organizational culture and change. We got to know what it is. There's a definition for you. Implicit assumptions held by members determine how to perceive, think about, and react to problems and issues. And I think it's a real key moment to think about implicit and explicit assumptions for organizations. Again, as I talk to leaders across the board, a couple of things jump out to me. Number one, I think since the middle of March, when this pandemic hit really hard, particularly on the East and West Coast, now more difficult perhaps in the middle part of the nation, immediately leaders were doing what I would call shooting the 50-meter targets, those things that were right in front of them, making difficult choices about payroll, about investments, about furloughs, applying for government assistance, et cetera, et cetera. Now that we've sort of gotten into, if you will, a new battle rhythm, as we would call it in the military, is the time that I think leaders need to start thinking about the 250-meter targets, those things that I'm looking to shoot at and look at the changing contours of the environment. Two assumptions I've seen kicked around, which I think could be deadly. Assumption number one, and fewer of these people I think are around, are the belief that, oh, well, we're going to hang on for a couple of months. This is all going to kind of disappear one day. And then one bright morning, it'll basically be the 1st of December 2019, and we can just kind of pick up where we left off, where the economy was doing great, and we'll all live happily ever after. Deadly. Second, more nuanced, but probably equally or perhaps even more deadly, is the assumption I think some leaders make when thinking about the culture and why they go ahead, and that is that, yes, we're going to have to change. The new environment is going to be different, but I don't want to begin any changes until I got a firm understanding of exactly what that environment's going to look like, and then I'll begin thinking about a change direction for my organization. Too late, missed of opportunities, and I think perhaps that could be equally deadly. Okay, so I asked this question, why do we really care about organizational culture? And that's the reason that culture eats your strategy for lunch every single day. So as you're thinking about a strategy for any organization, large or small, it's a balance between three things. The ends, what are the goals of the organization that we have, the ways, the policies, procedures, and plans that we put in effect, and then last but not least, the means, resources, people, money, and the one resource I think oftentimes not thought about, which may be the most inelastic, how much time do we have to affect this? So this is why organizational change matters. Quickly, people will say, well, organizational culture and organizational climate the same thing? The answer to that question is no, they are not. Let's touch on climate and culture for a second more. Climate, you see here, the feeling that is conveyed in a group by the physical layout and the way in which members interact with each other, customers and outsiders. As you can see, it's very direct, very organizational, depends a lot on the personality, and relatively quickly to change. You can see a change in client just by bringing in a new leader or a mid-level leader, and you can watch over a period of even a few days, if not a few weeks, to see the actual climate of that organization or team change. Culture, much more different, much more strategic, less personality driven, and takes a long, long time and is much more difficult to change. Here's a quick, handy, reliable climate survey you might take a look at that you can give your organization and just see how people react. And it's sort of like taking a thermometer to judge your climate. Right now, it's probably difficult to do that because many of you are working at disparate locations. You're meeting with your team by Zoom as opposed to a physical meeting. A lot of talk now about will we ever go back to the traditional office space. A lot of people saying we won't. I actually say, I'm going to wait and see on that one. Voltaire once said that man is, and he meant men and women, of course, is a social animal. And I think the interaction between human beings is key to them, key to their intellectual creativity as well as their intellectual health. So I think there will be some motivation to do that, number one. Number two, quite candidly, all the data I read that says, oh, productivity is way up while we're working at home. Okay, well, it's been about 90 days, and I think the length of that data point is still fairly brief, but we'll need to do this for a longer period of time to make that judgment, number one. And number two, tell me how you judge, how you count productivity. Finally, as a data point of one, I remember talking to a woman. Her and her husband were both working at home now, and they both have grade school age children. So I asked her and him, they're both executives, how that was working out. And she simply said that she was preparing a sign to put in her front yard, and the sign was going to say, my children's teachers have lied to me forever because they have always said when I went to school for the parent visit that my children are a joy to be with every day. And I know that's not true. So I'm not sure how that'll affect productivity long term. If you think about your digital climate, what I would emphasize is a couple things. Is my mission clear? And I always tell organizations, one test that I always say on your digital climate is get on your website and count the number of clicks it takes till you get to the mission statement of the organization. I always find it stunning that I'll get on a website for a large organization and I have one hell of a time finding out what the mission of this organization is, what its vision is, and what its values are, which should be the guiding light, the guardrails of the entire organization. Secondly, I'd say right now in a digital world, a much more effective, much more intense communication plan using all the different aspects of communication. Do we have a vehicle that allows people in the organization to submit feedback and new ideas as we adapt to a new environment? And are we keeping them informed? We talked briefly about some of my experiences in past and difficult times. And I can tell you from my time in combat, the one thing every soldier wants to know is what in the hell is going on. And they always assume you as the leader know more about what's going on than they do, which sometimes isn't true. And they just want to be reassured about what's going on. So how do I keep them informed about what's going on and what kind of future events? And then finally, how are people treated in the organization, even if including those who may have to be furloughed or let go? More on that perhaps later on. Okay, leadership and culture. One of the primary responsibilities of a leader is to influence his or her organizational culture. Culture is created in part by leaders and is one of the most decisive functions of their leadership. Sometimes they even have to destroy the culture to rebuild the organization based on changing conditions. And Edgar Schlein, who you'll see me quote a number of times in all this, is one of the gurus and the most prolific writers on this particular organization. What new values, beliefs, and assumptions are now being adopted in your organization based on changed environment? What behaviors should follow from those cultural changes? And can we draw on existing culture to provide strength and unity for the organization in the middle of this difficult time? So building on that a second more, then what's that got to do with leadership? Well, this is why it's important to leaders like you. It gives members in your organization identity, a bit of commitment, social stability in the organization, and shapes behavior. When managed correctly, it is an indirect means by which leaders influence others and shape motivation, consensus, and moving ahead. But you have to think for a minute about who are the members of my organization. Now that may sound like a silly question, and for some of you, based on your client base, perhaps it may be pretty easy for you to describe. For more complex, for public service organizations, for nonprofit organizations, that can actually be something you have to sit down and think about. Who exactly are my stakeholders? Let me give you an example. I work a lot with leadership teams in large urban school districts all across the United States, a number of them in the LA metropolitan area where many of you come from. Well, I gotta tell you, if you're a superintendent of a large school district, here are all your stakeholders that you gotta deal with at any given moment, all these people. I just got off the phone with one of the school districts I work with there, not too far from where many of you are in Southern California. And he told me, Jeff, here's the situation I'm dealing with right now. I've got to come up with 3 plans. One plan to bring everybody back to school normally while creating a safe environment. Second plan, to continue to deliver education totally online. Third plan, to do some hybrid between those two. Oh, by the way, I've been directed that we're going to take a $10 million cut in budget because the fact that the state of California has spent so much money dealing with the economic consequences of this crisis. And within my district, it's about evenly split. About half the parents want their kids to go back to school normally, and about half want them to stay home and do it online. Other than that, everything is just dandy. So when you think about the culture of the organization and change, you got to figure out, first of all, who are my stakeholders? Who are the people I've got to influence? Organizational culture and changing it is difficult because it can be tough to identify, manage, and requires time and effort. So what are we talking about when we talk about organizational culture? Well, look at it like an iceberg. The culture of your organization, above the waterline, the smallest part are artifacts. Working hours. We work, our stores open from 8 to 5. Okay, our school is open from this period of time to that period of time. We're not open on weekends, we are open on weekends. Dress code, basic behavior, less visible. What are the values, the strategies of the organization, our goals, philosophies? These are our espoused values. Much deeper down, but still very essential to the culture of organization. Assumptions and values. This is more subconscious. Oftentimes, the beliefs that are taken for granted, our traditions, our thoughts, our feelings. At the extreme, what can this look like? Well, I worked with a school district one time, and they were in the midst of a consolidation of schools. These were high schools that were being consolidated because of changes of demography in a city. That may not sound all that difficult. Believe it or not, one of the biggest arguments was, what are we going to be called? In other words, just like the Redskins, okay, are arguing right now about what are we going to be called? Well, you got two schools, and I forget what their particular mascots were, but what's the new mascot going to be? And what do we do with all the trophies from the two schools, which are part of our traditions and our values and all that kind of stuff? Where do all the trophies go? So when all the alumni come back, you know, they can now go to this new consolidated school and see themselves recognized. A very difficult problem, which you might not have thought of it to begin with. As you can see from these two guys right here, I don't know how it started either. All I know is that's part of our corporate culture. It can come on and all of a sudden you realize that's what you do. It can affect some things within the organization that are even more subtle. I'll give you perhaps what might sound like a silly example. We teach a lot of seminars for organizations on executive wellness. We were talking to one organization. It turned out they had a sort of a cultural tradition. This is somewhat superficial. Within the office, every day somebody brought a different type of donuts or rolls from a store to the office every single day, and we piled them up there, bagels or whatever, by the coffee machine. They did that every single day. It became a norm within the organization. But we talked to them about executive wellness and weight, and health, and heart disease, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly they realized that this norm was having a negative effect on the team, even though it was kind of a cultural icon. So they changed all that and went over to providing fruit and whatever. So they had to change what might sound like a silly but small cultural icon, just like these guys wearing red and gray hats. The other thing you got to think about is, do I have a unity of culture, or are there subcultures within my organization? You can see a unitary organization to the left, a disorganized on the right. A more diversified subculture is obviously more difficult to change. Something you might think about in terms of pulling that together is a book written by a guy I greatly aspire, who actually is a friend of mine, and that's a guy named Stan McChrystal, who's a retired 4-star general. He wrote a very fascinating book about his experiences commanding complex organizations in Afghanistan and Iraq, called Team of Teams. Team of Teams. How to bring teams together in an integrated structure because of the subculture issues you see right here. Again, I'll continue on using this metaphor from the school district. Within a school district, which I've worked with, I've found you've got teachers as one culture. You got the staff, the administrative staff as another culture. You've got buildings and grounds. You've got the cleaning staff. You've got food service. You've got transportation. Each of those are subcultures, and oftentimes each of those subcultures are underscored by the fact that they may have unions. And right now, that superintendent I mentioned a little while ago, who's dealing with 3 plans, $10 million cut in budget. Now that was manifested in how he could get those different cultures, those different unions to agree. And that was his biggest problem. He was dealing with this problem right now and trying to deal with change for the coming school year. So what are we doing? We're negotiating a potential, at times, conflict of values between espoused values and enacted values. In essence, are we doing what we think we say we do? Example of great and pure individual is the only thing that can lead us to noble thoughts and deeds. I'll use an old movie as an example, because right now I hear from a lot of friends of mine who are looking for a film, old or new, to watch on Netflix. And so if you haven't seen this film, I strongly recommend it to you. It's an old movie back to, I think, either the early 90s or the late 80s, called Scent of a Woman with Al Pacino. It's a great film. He wins an Academy Award. But towards the end of the film, and it's all about a guy who is blind. He's a former soldier, came out of the military, and for a wild weekend, he is sort of taken care of by a young student who's about to be expelled from a school because he has knowledge of an incident of mischief that a number of his fellow students have done against the rather autocratic dean of this finishing school that he is attending. Anyway, to give away a little bit, at the very end of the film, there's this sort of trial in this big auditorium with all kinds of pictures of old dead white guys who were former deans of the school hanging on the wall. It is dripping culture to decide whether this young man is going to be kicked out or not. And Al Pacino gives this amazing Shakespearean soliloquy. If you don't want to watch the movie, just go on YouTube and watch that last soliloquy by Al Pacino. But in essence, what is Pacino doing in that? He is doing exactly what this slide says. He is talking to them about, this is what you say you are. This is what you say you value. This is what you're doing. And these two things are totally inconsistent at all times. Off the record, I taught at Penn State University for a number of years. I live here in South Central Pennsylvania, now teach at a smaller college. And I can tell you, when the great disaster at Penn State occurred over a former assistant football coach abusing young children, some people pointed out this is what the mission of the university said they were, but they were allowing this to go on. Espoused values, enacted values, now in conflict for the culture. So how do we go about negotiating change? Well, you got to determine a couple things as the person in charge. What do I want it to be? Why do you want it to be that? And what can I and should I do to get there? Let's talk about modifying culture. How do you modify culture? What does the organization pay attention to? As you see a crisis, how you handle a crisis. So a crisis is an opportunity, as Rahm Emanuel said, to affect change in the crisis. Criteria for recruiting people. Oh, by the way, criteria for getting rid of people. Again, I know of a guy who took over a very large organization. This was right before 2008. They had a huge cut in their budget based on the effects of the recession. I talked to him later on. I said, how'd it go? He said, it was fantastic. I said, what was fantastic about that? He said, well, I had a number of changes that I wanted to affect in the organization, but I figured it was going to take me 5 years or more to get those done. Hell, I got them all done within a year and a half. I blamed it all on the crisis. I had a number of people that I really wanted to encourage to retire, and I'd already identified who they were, but I knew it was going to be difficult to do all that because of human resource management issues. Hell, I got rid of all of them in a year or so because I told them, hey, I don't know how it's going to go, and you might want to take this retirement package now. So the criteria for recruiting new people, and also, if you will, for having other people go off to do other things, is certainly how you modify culture. And a lot of you are going through that right now, I'm sure, with your staff, within your organization. How do you do that? How do you actually furlough people? Did you stay in contact with them? We have seen awful things being done. Weight Watchers had a Zoom meeting, and during the Zoom meeting, which lasted less than 5 minutes, told the 500 people on the Zoom call who had no idea why they were supposed to be on the call that they had all been released. They had all been fired. This is not the way to handle that or encourage change, because obviously that sends a message not only to those 500 people that were released, it also sends a message to everybody else in terms of the values of the organization. In addition, criteria for promotions, allocating rewards, our rituals, our policies, etc., are all how leaders modify culture by changing those things. What are some of the essential ingredients for transformation? Well, the first thing is the leader has got to come up with a sense of urgency and then assemble the right team and the right strategy and get buy-in. Too oftentimes, by the way, most change people argue about 70% of the time, it fails. It fails. Why? I think a lot of times because leaders spend time thinking about the change they're going to make. They call everybody into a big auditorium. They brief them on this change we're going to make. They go back to their office, they sit down, they're exhausted because they spent so much time thinking about this new plan. But they figure everybody's going to take off and immediately rush off to affect all this change. And they don't realize that's where the hard work really begins, okay? When you get buy-in from your key people, make sure they don't face any barriers, try to find some easy wins and keep the urgency going. You got to articulate the vision for the organization. One thing I think is important right now, and a guy I like a lot, either in his books or in his speaking, is a guy named Simon Sinek. And Sinek talks an awful lot about finding your why. Why do we do this? What is the purpose in our work? Even for profit corporations, that we're finding, I think employees find that particularly compelling, particularly among millennials. I'll give you an example. I did some work for a fast food restaurant change. And this was a major question for the workforce. Why should I make these products? Why should I go to this restaurant? Why should I deliver this product to a home at this particular difficult moment? And the workforce talked about this and they concluded the following. People are able to have a dinner meal together now more likely than before the pandemic because mom and dad are at home, number one. And number two, in many cases, we are delivering food to homes, hot meals to homes that people might not get that, or because they have a particular health condition, they might be more exposed to the pandemic if they went outside. So our purpose is to do just that. Deliver a meal so the family can dine together and in fact, perhaps help them avoid the possibility of being infected and try to do that in a very safe fashion for us as well as them. Many organizations have not been able to do that. Sears and Roebuck is a good example. 5 years ago, Sears and Roebuck had 2,000 locations. February this year, even before the pandemic, it shut down an additional 96 stores, bringing the total in the U.S. to 182. In 2018, of course, it had declared bankruptcy, and even though at one point it had over $7 billion in assets. It could not change to meet the new reality, even prior to the pandemic, that Walmart, Amazon, and others were able to do. On a positive side, think of Volkswagen. Volkswagen came back from an amazing disaster when it was discovered the corporation had cheated on emission standards, causing a large number of senior leadership to resign, either be prosecuted, and enormous multi-million-dollar fines being levied on the organization. They have recovered, and if you listen to what they say now at the senior end, they say this particular crisis allowed us now to become one of the major manufacturers of electric cars, and that is the direction that we are now going to go. So with all that in mind, why is change so hard? Why is this so hard? Well, because what you're trying to do is get people to change who have been successful in the organization already. No matter how faulty the system organizational was, or no matter how different the environment was, they go, okay, but I was successful like these fish. I was successful up until now. And suddenly, their environment has just changed. In January of this year, I was able to take a trip with my youngest son, to the Galapagos Islands. And if you've never been to the Galapagos, I strongly encourage you to go to the Galapagos. It's a fascinating place. We had a lot of scientists on board who talked about Charles Darwin. One thing they pointed out to us was that Darwin never said the strongest species survive. He never said that. It's often quoted, but that's untrue. What he said was The species that can adapt survives. The species that can adapt survives. So I don't want to kid you, the change is really hard. But if you don't think change is necessary, then think about the following organizations that we have all seen in our lifetime. Think about Eastman Kodak, who in the early 1990s at a board meeting decided that digital photography was a passing fancy. Think of BlackBerry, which in the year 2000, 2001, really had a corner of the market for cell phones. If you're like me, I owned multiple BlackBerries when I worked in the corporate world, almost totally extinct. Think of Blockbuster Videos. There is one Blockbuster store left. It's in Redmond, Oregon. The rest of them are gone. These are organizations that could not change due to a new environment. So one of the primary obstacles to change, you got to change the thinking of people. That's why it's hard. Number two, you've got to be persistent. And many transformation fails primarily because the people would not or could not change. Therefore, the culture could not change. I worked with a corporate exec one time. He was going to announce a big change to the organization, a new strategy, a new direction. He got the whole leadership team, a couple hundred people in an auditorium, as I described a moment ago, gave this big presentation with all these great slides, had his primary leadership team of about 10 people, senior leadership team sitting in the front row. We met later that day because he wanted to get my reaction. He said, what do you think? He was very excited. I said, which of those 10 people in that front row who are your senior leadership team do you believe are convinced, number one, of the direction you described, and are your change agents? He looked at me and he said, none of them. I said, exactly. You're in a hole, man. If you can't get them on board, this is going to be really, really tough. They're going to slow roll you forever. And just changing processes, technologies, organizational structure ain't enough. Ain't enough. All right. How do you analyze this? Well, traditionally, going back to Cotter and Cohen, they would say this is how you do it. You do analysis, impact, and results. Analysis, gather info, influence people's thinking, and from that comes new thoughts, behavior, and reinforce that behavior. Simple, straightforward, probably not as dynamic as it should be. They updated this approach later on in a later study, and this one I think is much more compelling. First of all, they said you got to see the problem and create a compelling, dramatic situation. Well, the crisis may have helped you in that regard. Help others visualize not only the problem, but visualize the solutions and get buy-in from them about that. Obviously, evoke a visceral response and reduce emotions that block change. And then finally, new ideas and reinforce change behavior is perhaps a better approach. Let's look at an illustration. Focusing on the past or the future. Disney Corporation had slid badly in the 1980s and hit rock bottom with animated films with the film called The Black Cauldron you see on the left. Now, if you go down to Disney World and the corporate headquarters, they have a hallway called the Hallway of Princesses. And they've got these beautiful paintings of all of the princesses from the past, from Sleeping Beauty to Snow White. You got them all, right? Little Mermaid, all of them are on this particular Hallway of Princesses. The only princess who never made the cut was the princess in the Black Cauldron. You'll never find her there. They had hit rock bottom, okay? They just had come to the conclusion that we can keep rolling the same old thing out and people will buy it up. Didn't work. They had a renaissance in the 1990s with Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, and The Lion King. When they reorganized and they removed all the stuff that really had harkened back to Walt and Roy Disney, who had passed away, from the conference room and started looking ahead. Then they got involved, whoops, I'm sorry about that, with Pixar's and et cetera, and now have had amazing successes in the aftermath. So Princess, and her name is Elanwe, if you ever want to get into Trivial Pursuit, who is the princess in the Black Cauldron, is the one that never made the cut to be there with Pocahontas, Mulan, The Little Mermaid, etc. Some, however, now argue that if you talk about a corporation that is focusing on enormous change because of the pandemic, Disney may be the one. And all of you have seen, either in California or in Florida, the efforts to reopen the parks, how's it going to go, social distancing, reduced population, etc. Don't forget that Disney also maintains not only theme parks, but cruise ships. Anybody going on a cruise lately? I don't think so. So the threat to Disney as an organization in this pandemic is huge. And they have furloughed over 43,000 employees out of their overall workforce of 200,000 employees. Obviously, the first theme park that we closed was the Shanghai theme park, and I do not know if that one has been reopened. And at one point, Disney was losing somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 million a day. So they changed to meet one crisis. Now it'll be an open question whether they can change to meet another. Here are some of the reinforcing mechanisms that leaders should think about. Embedding mechanisms. What do we measure? What do we pay attention to? What do we control? How do we measure success is one of the most difficult things that a leader who's trying to move his organization in the direction of change needs to think about. Are we maintaining a certain degree of calm in that process as I am modeling behavior for the organization? What are my reward criteria, etc.? And more and other reinforcing mechanisms, maybe such things as reorganizational design, systems, physical layouts, emphasizing, if you will, our stories, legends, and myths can be very, very important. Where have we come from? Because they will reinforce that notion of purpose. You got to have both reinforcing mechanisms as well as change mechanisms. Otherwise, you end up like Petronius Arbiter here. This may be apocryphal, but it's a great quote. And I'll read it to you. We trained hard, but it seemed that every time we were getting to form up into a team, we would be reorganized. I was to learn later in life that we would tend to meet any new situation by reorganizing, and what a wonderful method it can be of creating the illusion of progress while producing confusion, inefficiency, and demoralization. We've all been through more than our share of reorganization. So to summarize, here's the Carter model again, creating a climate for change, engaging the whole organization, getting buy-in, creating some short wins, and then implementing and sustaining that change. Don't let it, make it stick in the organization. Well, let me summarize. Here are the things I think that summarize these 10 things, and I won't go over all of them, but you need to first to understand, then to be understood. What really is the problem? Get buy-in through your vision, communicate, communicate, communicate. Look for your change agents. Who are they? Identify them early. Gain and sustain momentum and seek to institutionalize new approaches. Celebrate wins. Even if they are small wins, look for opportunities to celebrate wins. But remember, above all, hope is not a method. As they say right here, but what if we don't change at all and something magical just happens? Well, I hear you, but hope is not a method. And we're seeing an awful lot of creativity and change going on during this coronavirus. Consider the Sesame Street staff. They changed very quickly and created from home because they couldn't go to the studio. Elmo's Playdate, special feature. Elmo had a virtual meetup with his Muppet pals and other celebrities during the pandemic to talk about the pandemic, reduce the fears among children. PBS also created a SWAT team to focus on appropriate content because of the pandemic. Downloads of PBS kid videos and game apps increased 80% in a few weeks. There were almost a million new downloads. The Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, which actually, if you don't realize this, is a spin-off of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, had over 50 million streams, up about 20%. But they reached back to their past and the culture at the same time, and Fred Rogers had provided a guiding principle for them to use, which was what is mentionable is manageable. So therefore, we can mention this particular virus to young children, incorporate it into our programming, and that becomes manageable. Well, finally, the future has several names, as Victor Hugo said. For the weak, it is impossible. For the faint-hearted, it is unknown. And for the thoughtful and the valiant, it is the ideal. And just remember, it was a day like today that Marco Polo said, why not take a walk and go to China? What are you all thinking about doing this afternoon? In the aftermath of the 2008 economic downturn, it was discovered that companies that engage with their workforce and thought about change and got feedback and enabled them to succeed during the crisis recovered far more quickly. Over time, loyalty within the team increased, and they were more willing to accept change that were brought about by a so-called new normal. With that, Tom, I'm right at about 35 minutes, which is about where I wanted to be. I'm going to turn it over to you for Q&A.
So Jeff, this is Linda.
Oh, I'm sorry, Linda. Forgive me, Linda.
No, perfect. Would you go back to that last Cotter slide, 4 slides back that you showed? As a bit of context, I grew up.
That one there?
Yeah, perfect. I grew up in Switzerland, and that's where I learned to ski. And one of the methods that the ski instructors used as you were skiing downhill is they would ski next to the students, and with their pole, they would tap you on the back of the knees and say, flex your knees, flex your knees. And it's an image and a story and a metaphor that I use with all of my clients to get them to understand their job as leaders is to have flexible knees, because you don't know what moguls you're about to hit. And there's no perfect way of negotiating them other than to be able to respond to obstacles and recover your balance. And so I'm really curious in your discussions now with leaders during a very externally politically driven, perpetually changing, turbulent conditions like we have right now, how are you discussing with leaders how to be as leaders and what to be communicating and what I've just gone blank on the word we're looking for, you know, the people who go out and advocate to
Change agents.
to keep reinforcing the ideas in the organization, where constantly from outside that organization they're being told, today it's mask, today it's no mask, today it's in on sidewalks, wait, no, you can't, you know, every aspect of business is perpetually being externally bombarded with requirements to change. So
Yeah, that's a great question and a tough one. I liked your metaphor to skiing, and one thing I'll come back to, my own ski story is, you get to this one right here, communicate for buy-in, which is one thing I tell leaders to do, and it leads into a longer response to your question. I actually learned to be a ski instructor. And I was taking a ski instructor course, and we had this really old, it was a Swiss guy. He was, frankly, he was an old, no offense, he was an old wizened up guy, Swiss guy. And being in Switzerland, you've seen these guys who spent their whole lives skiing, you know, every day for whatever length of time the winter would allow. So by the time they got to be in their 50s and 60s, their faces looked like, you know, down on the back of a buffalo nickel. I mean, they were very weather-beaten people. Really nice guy, but pretty weather-beaten old guy. So we go up to the top of the slope, we ski down, we stop, we're all lined up. This guy looks at us and he says, I'm now going to teach you the most important thing you need to know to teach skiing. And I'm thinking, great, we're getting right to the guts of it right now. And he looked at us and he said, the student has got to be in a position to learn. He said, in other words, if it is 25 below zero and sleet is hitting them in the face, and you want them to stand quietly on a ski slope for 20 minutes while you describe the pole plan, they're not listening, okay? They're not listening. So in similar fashion, how do I communicate with my team? What do I communicate? Well, I have to, first of all, think about all the different mechanisms that I've got available to me to communicate, because unfortunately we haven't got the opportunity to be in the office. And I really think that is something that we have over time undervalued. The ability of people just to go by the water cooler and have a chat, or pop in the boss's office and have that quick conversation to, if you will, reinforce the direction they're heading in. That's all gone. We've got to figure out how we recreate that. So obviously the periodic meetings are very important. I always say it's very important to decide up front and tell your team, based on what we're doing right now, is this an information meeting or a decision meeting? If it's just an information meeting, great. We go through real quick what's going on. Okay, if it's a decision meeting, what is the decision going to be? What's the problem? So everybody knows in advance, so we can prepare to have a conversation. But in advance, everybody knows, am I going to an information meeting or a decision meeting, particularly if you're doing that on Zoom, which is one of the most likely platforms, or some similar platforms, or a teleconference. Second of all, I tell a lot of leaders, you got to talk to them about what's going on, how you see the environment, and you have to be what I'm calling realistically optimistic. realistically optimistic, because nobody in the organization is going to be any more optimistic than you are. They may get to your level of optimism. They will rarely exceed that. So obviously, if you are totally pessimistic, don't expect raging optimism to break out, okay? By the same token, you have to be realistic. If you come across to the organization and you say, hey, you know, everything's fine, it's going to be great, everybody's going to think after a while you're either crazy, you're clueless, or you're lying to us, one of the three. So you still got to be somewhat realistic in your optimism. Realistic in your optimism. You got to identify who are my change agents and encourage them. You're exactly right. It's a very difficult thing because you're bombarded in different directions by external ideas, mask, no mask, all that kind of stuff. So what I think you have to do is establish your own protocols, consistent what seems to be reasonable and logical based on, I would argue, science and fact and conditions in your community, and say that's our protocol. I talked to a superintendent the other day back to the school districts, which I work with, and he said, Jeff, you know, what am I going to do if we decide to go back and we set up protocols to wear masks, and I have one of my principals or a teacher that says, well, I refuse to do that. I refuse to do that. I said, well, that actually is pretty easy. He said, really? I said, yeah. You just look at him in the eye and you go, look, you know, I love you forever. But that's the protocol we've agreed to, that everyone is going to subscribe to as part of this organization. So I'm not angry, upset, or otherwise, but if you will unwilling to subscribe that protocol, then I guess you will play on this ball team. And once this, so therefore you are furloughed, retired, or whatever. And once this pandemic is over and we can go back to a circumstance that you find convenient for you to rejoin us, perhaps we'll discuss that. But I haven't got time or energy to discuss the merits of that one way or the other. We've got our protocol. This is the protocol we're going to affect, and we can't have individual protocols for every person in the organization. And then last but not least, it's difficult, but I think empowerment at a time like this in a decentralized environment is more important than ever. Too oftentimes there's a human, I think, reaction of leaders that when things are difficult, that's when they really try to take full control. And sometimes that can be the wrong thing to do. How do I empower my team to make choices and demonstrate initiative? I would stress, and then I'll shut up here because I'm more long-winded than I wanted to be, but it was a great question. The one area where I would absolutely have pretty draconian control is my social media, because I've worked with a lot of organizations that under normal times have a fairly decentralized system for their social media in terms of what do we post on our Facebook page or our Twitter account or those kind of things. And various people in the organization are empowered to do that. Now, during a crisis like this, particularly if you're dealing with problems of are we shutting down, opening up, are we furloughing people or not, I would assume draconian control of my social media, and nothing gets posted on that unless I'm aware of it or I approve it, because all kinds of bad things can happen. And if you don't believe me, next time that you've got nothing else to do, just Google stupid tweets and you'll be amazed how many things will appear. I think I went on too long, but
no, it's perfect. And before I turn it over to Tom, I just want to share an insight that came to me as you were describing this, which is that leaders need to not only view their change agents in that role, but teach them that they're also stabilizing agents and help them with the scripts to use when they have folks who don't want to go along with whatever's been declared because of the anxiety over things constantly changing and everybody grappling to feel they have some level of control in their lives, including in this work environment that's perpetually changing. And so thank you so much for that, because I think, you know, in talking with leaders, it's going to be not just who's your change agent, but that same individual needs to have their skills developed and be given the scripts the organization's leaders want used for handling those conflict conversations.
And you may need to consider for those people, are there additional resources I need to provide them, because they are a change agent in terms of people, money, and time. And the other thing you can do, and this is sort of a tactical thing, quite frankly, is say to them, hey, if it's really tough and you want to play good cop, bad cop, we can do that. In other words, you can tell that person, yep, I'm sorry, that's the protocol and that's not my choice. You know, the boss decided that's the way it's going to be. And so, you know, don't waste my time talking to me about it. If you really want to discuss that particular aspect of our protocol, head up the stairs and talk to him. You know, so
Yeah.
get them off target. You know, let them be the good cop, you be the bad cop.
Yeah, very true. Tom,
So do we have other questions? Anybody want to raise their hand and jump in with a question?
you don't. People were deeply engaged. So let's see if anybody has anything in the next few minutes that they'd like to raise as their own questions.
Just turn on your mic and feel free to ask a question.
Yep, jump in. By the way, I think my good friend Jim Davis is on this call, and so I want to make sure and do a shout out to Jim Davis, who I owe an enormous amount to.
Hi, Jeff. I liked your ski instructor analogy, and one of the things I think is important right now is people are wondering, before they're open to change, they're wondering what's going to happen to me. And I think if a leader can say, I am not going to lay anybody off for the next 6 months, or just to be upfront and let people know what is the impact for them. Now they're more open to learning, as you said. They're not worrying about that. And even if it's only 3 months, at least they know they're safe for that period of time, or they're not safe.
No, I think you're exactly right. Because what people are looking for, Jim, is predictability. What's the predictability and how that applies to me? And the other thing I think we forget during normal times, and it becomes more important now, is everybody's got a pandemic story. You know, we think at times people come to work and whatever's going on at home, as soon as they get in the car and shut the door and back out of the driveway, all that goes away. And they kind of re-inherit that situation when they pull back in the driveway at the end of the day. Well, that's probably not true on a good day. It's darn sure not true on a difficult day like this. Every one of them has children, like this lady I said wanted to put this sign about the teachers lied to me in her front yard because she was trying to educate, you know, elementary age kids at home while trying to hold her job at the same time. So they got that issue. They may have relatives who are in harm's way because they have compromised health issues. They may have aging parents that are in a retirement home, or because of health issues or advanced age, are particularly susceptible to the virus that are a point of concern. So that whole portion of what does it mean for me, you're exactly right. And then on top of all that, for a host of reasons that is a totally different conversation, we in the United States, by the structure of our society, are such that most people's health insurance is tied to their employment. So them losing their job is not only a salary issue, it is also a healthcare issue that occurs in the middle of a pandemic, which makes it even much greater concern. And so I think you're exactly right about giving them predictability. The other thing is how you handle the furlough. I'm back to Weight Watchers and doing it over a 3-minute Zoom call, not the way to go about it. Are there ways to go about this? Are there early retirement packages? Are there ways to reduce people's hours without eliminating them totally? Are there mechanisms where you furlough people, but you make every attempt to stay in contact with them in hopes that we're going to see things turn around, or there's going to be more government assistance so I can bring you back? I really think those organizations that treat their people well, even the ones that they may be forced to separate by economic demand, will benefit in the longer term, because even those who are kept will say to themselves, this is an organization that is loyal to me as well as wanting me to be loyal to it. And consequently, this is a ball team that I want to play on.
Howard, it looks like your speaker's off. You have a question?
No, I was going to ask 2 questions. Jeff, have you written any books we might read, or do you have a podcast or something like that?
Howard, first of all, you're sort of my straight man, Howard. This is our info. That's our website. You go on the website and you can find more info about my company, or you can send us an email to that email address, and I'd be happy to add you to our newsletter. We do not sell your email addresses to Amazon or anything like that. And we put out a short newsletter with both a podcast attached and an article about different aspects of leadership, usually on a weekly basis. This is what we do, which Tom talked about in terms of oftentimes using historical case studies to talk about leadership principles. Gettysburg, Yorktown, Alamo are 3 that we do. We do 2 others that you might be interested in, particularly in California. I've done one number of times at the Nixon Library there in LA, and I've done it elsewhere, of course, using Watergate as a case study on particularly leadership for leaders during very stressful times, and also ethics in leadership. And we've done that at the Nixon Library, which is great fun. And then finally, we do a leadership case study using Pearl Harbor as a case study. I was supposed to be in Honolulu in May for a week doing that for a corporate group, which unfortunately didn't happen. But we do that. And in California, I've done it numerous times aboard the battleship Iowa, which is ported there in Long Beach, and they have converted the day room, the officer's day room aboard the ship, into a classroom. So it's a really cool place to do this case study on Pearl Harbor aboard a battleship. The Iowa, to be historically correct, was not physically in Honolulu during the attack on Pearl Harbor, but is of the same class of some of the battleships that were there. And so it's kind of a very, very fascinating location to do that. And then finally, to prove that you were my straight man, my book's coming out on leadership lessons from Gettysburg, which just uses the battle as a case study and then talks about what you can learn from different aspects of the battle, walks you through the battle from before the battle through day 3 and actually the Gettysburg Address, and will be coming out 1 September 2020, or is available at barnesandnobles.com, amazon.com, or bookshop.com right now. And then last but not least, and I told Tom Reynolds this yesterday, we have actually worked out a way so that if you do in fact purchase the book and you send me an email to that info@diamond6leadership.com, I will send you an autographed book plate for the book that you can put inside that for yourself or anyone you'd like to share it with. So there's my, there's my advertisement. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I bought my copy. I highly recommend everybody do that. So we're very close to the end. I've got a couple little announcements. Any other questions real quick for Jeff?
Yeah, I just was wondering what the assignments or what the Diamond 6 or the number 6 plays.
Yeah, where that all came from is, we chatted about that before, Tom, is the most impactful leadership experience in my lifetime, unquestionably. I spent 30 years in uniform, retired as an Army colonel, was the commander of an artillery battalion. That's my granddaughter in the background. Charlotte, I'll be right there. Bye-bye, Charlotte. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye. It's my 4-year-old granddaughter. Sorry about that. Anyway, so the most impactful leadership experience I ever had was command of an artillery battalion during the Gulf War back in 1990 and 91. And we were part of the lead attack force for the 7th U.S. Corps into Iraq in early 1991. I had 750 soldiers assigned. They were all guys, because that's the way it was in those days. And through the grace of God and a lot of great leadership on the part of young soldiers, sergeants, and lieutenants, we got through all that and we didn't lose anybody. We had several guys get wounded, but we didn't lose anybody. And I got them all home. So in a unit, every company-sized unit has a noun for radio call sign purposes associated with it. The headquarters battery company of that artillery battalion was Diamond. One of my predecessors, 8 or 10 before me, had selected that particular noun and it stuck with it. 6 is the commander, 5 is the deputy, 4 is the logistician, 3 is your ops officer, 2 is your intel officer, and 1 is your personnel officer. So Diamond 6 is the commander. That was me. That was my radio call sign. And I decided that if I was ever going to create an organization, I was going to name it Diamond 6 after that particular experience and all those outstanding soldiers. So that's where it came from.
Thank you.
Very cool. So this is the second to last next gen for season 1. There'll be a season 2 starting in mid-September. I've already got a great list of speakers for us, all designed to help us think through how to deal with the COVID era. Our last speaker will be John Thompson, who's on the call. He's going to give us methods to implement some of the things that Jeff has talked about that are just practical tools that you can have and print and help you plan, organize, and change. So I want to thank you all for coming. Jeff, all right, will you make available your PowerPoint? Is that okay if I send it out?
Yeah, I'll send you a PDF version.
Thank you very much. A lot of people have requested that. I also am going to post this recording up on my blog at Reynolds Group Web. So you can see the whole video there along with the other 12 speakers we've had. So if you want to take a look at that. So thank you all for coming. And Jeff, you are the most awesome human being on earth. Thank you for joining us. And we'll all be in touch. Be well.
All right.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.